The stars above the human colony were no longer a peaceful sight. Instead, they were surrounded by dark clouds of destruction. Captain Tyran stood at the edge of the shattered city, watching as the last defense tower crumbled under the weight of alien firepower. Around him, the once thriving colony now lay in ruins, the streets empty, the buildings smoking husks. The Xarn, a ruthless and war-hardened alien species, had arrived. And they weren't leaving until they had wiped out humanity. Tyran had been prepared for battle. The humans had fought back fiercely, but no one had ever expected the Xarn to be this powerful. Their ships were massive, their weapons devastating, and their soldiers were relentless. One by one, the human defenses had fallen, and now there was nothing left but the smoldering remains of a once proud civilization. "Captain," a voice said behind him. Tyran turned to see Lieutenant Mara, a young officer who had fought beside him since the beginning. Her face was grim, her uniform torn, but her eyes were determined. "We can't hold them off much longer," she said. "The last of the fleet is retreating. We're on our own now." Tyran nodded, his mind racing. He had watched too many of his people fall. His soldiers, his friends, his family, all gone. The Xarn had not just come for conquest, they had come for destruction. They wanted to make an example of humanity, to show the galaxy that no species, no matter how strong, could stand against them. And right now, it seemed like the Xarn were going to win. But there was one thing Tyran knew that the Xarn didn't. Something they would never expect. Something they feared. He turned to Mara, his voice low. "There's one last chance. A secret weapon we've kept hidden." Mara raised an eyebrow. "A secret weapon? What are you talking about?" Tyran's gaze hardened. "It's not just a weapon. It's the last hope of humanity." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean? We don't have any more ships, no more armies. What can we possibly do against the Xarn?" Tyran didn't answer right away. He stared out at the burning horizon, the fires of the colony reflecting in his eyes. He had heard the stories, the rumors, the ones that said the human race had something, someone who could stand against the Xarn. But no one had believed it, not until now. "We have one thing they fear," Tyran said, his voice cold. "And it's time to unleash him." The underground facility was cold and dark, the air thick with dust. Tyran and Mara moved quickly through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the metal floors. Behind them, a small team of soldiers followed, their faces tense with worry. They didn't know what Tyran was talking about, but they trusted him. "We're almost there," Tyran said, glancing back at them. His eyes flickered with something like hope. It had been a long time since he had felt hope. Mara glanced nervously at him. "What are we about to do, Captain?" "We're going to wake him up," Tyran replied. The underground corridors were eerily quiet as Captain Tyran led the small group of soldiers through the cold, metallic hallways. Each step echoed in the silence, the weight of what was to come pressing heavily on their shoulders. The air felt stale, and the dim lights flickered sporadically, as if the facility itself was unsure about what was about to happen. Mara kept glancing nervously at Tyran. She had always trusted him, but now, as they moved deeper into the heart of the facility, uncertainty gnawed at her. The secrets that had been hidden here were unsettling. What kind of weapon was Project Revenant, and why had it been locked away for so long? "You sure about this, Captain?" Mara asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but Tyran could hear the doubt lingering beneath the surface. "I mean, what if it's not what we think it is?" Tyran didn't answer immediately. He kept his gaze ahead, his steps purposeful. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure. He'd been told that Project Revenant was humanity's greatest hope, a weapon capable of wiping out the Xarn. But there was a reason it had been hidden away for so long. The experiments had been too dangerous, and the last thing humanity needed was a weapon that couldn't be controlled. And yet, here they were, the last survivors of a dying colony, about to awaken something they didn't fully understand. "We don't have a choice, Mara," Turan said, his voice low and firm. "The Xarn are about to wipe us out, and if we don't act now, everything will be lost. Revenant is our only chance." They reached a massive steel door, its surface scarred by time. Turan paused, taking a deep breath. The air was heavy with the scent of burned metal as Turan and Mara led Revenant through the underground tunnels. The world above them was burning, and every second spent in the cold, silent corridors felt like an eternity. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the narrow spaces, a constant reminder of how little time they had left. Revenant walked with a grace that was unsettling. His movements were fluid, too controlled for someone who had just awoken from stasis. His eyes, those cold, glowing eyes, were scanning everything, taking in every detail. It was as if he wasn't just a man, but a predator, an apex being fully aware of his surroundings and the dangers that lurked. Turan couldn't help but watch him closely, unsure if what they had just unleashed was going to be their salvation, or their doom. "Mara," Turan said, his voice barely above a whisper as they moved down the dark corridors. "We need to reach the command center. That Xarn are closing in on the central reactor, and if they get to it, they'll destroy the colony," Mara finished, her face pale. "But how do we stop them? We have no fleet, no army. What's one man? No, what's he going to do against all of that?" Turan glanced over at Revenant, who was moving silently ahead of them, his eyes flickering with an unreadable intensity. "He's not just any man, Mara. You saw what he did to the pod. He's a weapon, a living nightmare for the Xarn." Mara wasn't sure what to believe. There was no way this man, this thing, could be a match for the entire Xarn army. Yet when she looked at him, there was something about his presence that sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't human anymore, not in the way they understood it. His body had been modified, enhanced, with alien technology and cybernetic implants. He was more machine than man, but there was still a core of humanity in him, buried deep beneath the cold exterior. As they neared the central command, Turan's mind raced. That Xarn had already breached the outer defenses, and now they were heading for the heart of the colony. If they didn't act fast, the entire system would be lost. And if Revenant couldn't hold them off, humanity would be wiped out once and for all. They'd reached the command center, the large steel door towering in front of them. It was reinforced, nearly impenetrable, but it was the last line of defense. The Xarn would be here soon, if they weren't already. Turan didn't hesitate. He punched in the emergency code, and the doors slowly slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, chaos reigned. The last few surviving officers were frantically trying to hold the line, sending out distress signals and preparing what little weaponry they had left. The Xarn ships loomed above the atmosphere, casting an ominous shadow over the city. The command center had become a sanctuary for the last hopes of humanity, and yet it was about to fall. Turan stepped inside, his eyes locking with the remaining officers. "We're not finished yet," he said, his voice unwavering. "Get ready to fight." But just as he spoke, Revenant moved past him, his eyes scanning the chaos around him. His movements were calm, controlled, like a man who had seen death before and knew how to handle it. With one swift motion, he reached for a nearby weapon rack, selecting a sleek energy rifle without breaking stride. "Get to the reactor," Revenant said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I will handle them." Mara's heart skipped a beat. The confidence in his voice was unsettling. This wasn't the same man they had found in the pod. This was something else entirely. Turan didn't argue. He motioned to the remaining officers, signaling them to follow him. "Mara, you come with me. We need to stop the Xarn from getting to the reactor." But as they moved to leave, a loud crash echoed through the command center. The ceiling above them exploded, sending debris flying in every direction. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, The sound of alien boots hitting the ground filled the air. The Karn had arrived. Their hulking forms emerged from the smoke, tall and menacing, their armor gleaming with malice. The sight of them was enough to freeze anyone in place, but not Revenant. He didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the first Karn soldier, and without a word, he raised his weapon. The energy rifle hummed to life in his hands, and with one swift shot, the first Karn soldier crumpled to the ground, a hole blasted clean through his chest. The others hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sudden attack. Revenant moved again, faster than the eye could follow, cutting down another Xarn warrior with a clean shot to the head. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like this. The way Revenant moved, the precision in his attacks, it was as if he had been built for this purpose alone. Every shot, every movement was calculated. He wasn't just fighting, he was hunting. Tyran's heart pounded in his chest. They had no time to waste. As Revenant held the Karn at bay, Tyran motioned for the remaining officers to follow him. "Go, get to the reactor," he shouted. Mara hesitated, watching as Revenant took down another soldier with terrifying efficiency. She couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and fear. What kind of monster had they unleashed? But there was no time to dwell on that now. Tyran grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit. The fate of the colony rested on their shoulders, and Revenant was their only chance. As they made their way down the hall, the sound of battle raged behind them. Revenant was still fighting, his movements a blur of violence and speed. The Xarn had no idea what they were up against, and by the time they figured it out, it might already be too late. But as they reached the reactor core, a cold feeling settled in the pit of Mara's stomach. She couldn't shake the thought that what they had unleashed was not just a weapon, but something far more dangerous, a ticking time bomb, one that might not stop until it had destroyed everything in its path. And she wasn't sure if that included them too. The corridor leading to the reactor core was bathed in a sickly yellow light, the hum of the cooling systems providing a constant background noise. Tyran and Mara moved quickly, their footsteps loud against the metallic floor as they approached the heavily fortified door at the end of the hall. Sweat beaded on Tyran's brow, though the air around them was cool. It wasn't the temperature that had his nerves on edge, it was the unknown. Behind them, the sound of battle raged on. Revenant was still holding the line, taking down Xarn soldiers with unrelenting precision. Every explosion, every gunshot, seemed to drive him further into a relentless state of focus. The way he fought was almost animalistic, like a creature with only one goal: destruction. He was no longer just a weapon. He was the fury of humanity's last stand. Tyran couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had awoken something far beyond their control, and while it might be their salvation now, what would happen when the Karn were gone? What would Revenant become once the fight was over? "We're almost there," Tyran said, his voice low, his hand steady on the control panel beside the door. "Once we get the reactor online, we can disable the Karn ships. We can at least give the last of humanity a chance to escape." Mara didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still on Revenant. The way he had handled the Karn, too efficient, too cold. It was like he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something else. She had seen warriors, soldiers driven by a sense of duty. But Revenant, he didn't feel human anymore. She couldn't shake the nagging thought that whatever he had become might turn against them once the threat was over. The door hissed open, and they entered the reactor control room. Inside, the large reactor sat at the center of the room, humming with life. It was a massive machine, its core pulsing with energy, a source of power for the entire colony. The control consoles were lined with holographic screens, most of them dark or flashing warnings. The colony was in critical condition, and the only way to stop the Karn was to overload the reactor, sending a pulse strong enough to disable their ships. Tyran's fingers flew over the control panel, entering the sequence to initiate the reactor's defense protocol. It was a delicate process, Too much power, and they risked destroying everything in the vicinity. Too little, and the Xarn would continue their relentless assault. It was a gamble, but it was their only shot. "Get ready," Tyran said, his eyes flicking to Mara. "Once I activate this, the Xarn ships will feel the shockwave. It should give us enough time to evacuate the remaining survivors. But we need to hurry." Mara nodded, though her thoughts were still on Revenant. She didn't trust him, not completely. They had no idea what would happen once the Xarn were gone, what he would do when his purpose had been fulfilled. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the impact of Xarn forces breaching the outer defenses. The reactor room's lights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. "They're here," Mara said, her voice tense. "They're at the outer perimeter." Tyran didn't pause. His eyes were fixed on the control panel as he initiated the sequence to overload the reactor. "We don't have time to wait for a full evacuation. If we don't do this now, we'll all die." Mara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The room was shaking more violently now, and she could hear the sounds of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were running out of time. The Xarn were coming, and the reactor needed to be activated immediately if they were to have any chance of survival. Suddenly, the door to the reactor room slammed open, and a dozen Xarn soldiers stormed in, their weapons raised and ready to fire. They were bigger, stronger, and more advanced than the human soldiers, their bodies covered in sleek armor that made them nearly indestructible. Their weapons were lethal, capable of cutting down a human in seconds. Mara didn't hesitate. She reached for her sidearm. But before she could fire, Revenant appeared in the doorway, moving faster than she could blink. The Xarn soldiers didn't have a chance to react before he was upon them. His rifle flashed, and the first Xarn fell to the ground, a clean shot to the chest. He moved like a shadow, effortlessly taking down one Xarn soldier after another. His movements were precise, methodical. Each kill was almost surgical in its efficiency. "Get to the reactor," Tyran shouted to Mara, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'll cover you." Mara nodded, heart pounding, and dashed toward the control panel. She could hear the sounds of battle behind her, but she kept her focus on the task at hand. She had to activate the overload sequence. If she didn't, everything would be lost. But as she reached the panel, a sudden crash sounded from behind her. She turned to see a Xarn soldier emerging from the smoke, his weapon aimed directly at her. She barely had time to react before the soldier fired, a blast of energy that sent her stumbling backward. Pain shot through her side as she hit the ground, her vision blurring. "No," Tyran's voice echoed in the chaos, but Mara couldn't see him. She was dazed, her body burning with pain. She tried to move, but the world felt distant, muffled. The Xarn soldier raised his weapon again, but before he could fire, a blur of motion appeared in front of him. Revenant. He moved so quickly that it was impossible to track him. With a swift, brutal motion, he grabbed the Xarn by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The soldier's body went limp instantly, his weapon falling to the floor with a clatter. Revenant turned, his gaze locking onto Mara. His eyes were still glowing, cold and unfeeling, but there was something else there, something almost human. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. "You're hurt," he said, his voice deep and mechanical. "I'm fine," Mara gasped, gritting her teeth as she pushed herself up. "We need to finish this." Without another word, Revenant stood and moved toward the remaining Xarn soldiers. He was like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. One by one, the Xarn fell before him, but Mara's attention was fixed on the reactor. She had to finish the overload sequence before it was too late. Her fingers flew over the control panel, inputting the final code. The reactor's core began to hum louder, the energy building to a critical point. She could feel the pulse of power vibrating in the air around her, a living thing that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. "Done," she shouted, her voice triumphant. The reactor's power surged, sending a shockwave throughout the colony. The Kharn ships in orbit trembled as the pulse reached them, their shields flickering as they struggled to compensate. It was working. The Kharn were feeling the effects of the reactor's pulse, and for the first time in hours, Mara allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. But even as the reactor's pulse ripped through the Kharn fleet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from out of danger. Something was still off about Revenant. He had saved her. But would he be their ally once the Kharn were gone? Or had they just unleashed something far worse than they could handle? The future was uncertain, and with every step they took, they were walking on the edge of a knife. The hum of the reactor's pulse still vibrated through the walls, the sudden surge of energy echoing in the now silent corridors. The Kharn forces, those that remained, were scrambling, retreating under the weight of the unexpected attack. The shielded vessels in orbit had flickered under the intense electromagnetic wave, their protective barriers weakening. This was humanity's chance, but in the stillness that followed, Mara couldn't shake the unease creeping over her. There was more to this than just winning a battle. Turan was already moving toward the control center, gesturing for Mara to follow. But she hesitated, her gaze lingering on Revenant. His back was to her, his figure a dark silhouette in the dim light, still as a statue. His movements were methodical, almost mechanical as he surveyed the chaos left in his wake. "Revenant," Mara called out, her voice tentative, uncertain. He turned to face her, his eyes as cold and unreadable as ever. His face was a mask. There were no emotions, no signs of relief for the victory they had just won. In fact, there was a strange stillness to him, something that unsettled her more than his brutal efficiency in battle. He was like a tool, a weapon, one that had just fulfilled its purpose. Yes. His voice was low, flat, the tone as emotionless as his expression. Mara swallowed, trying to keep her composure. She had seen soldiers break down after battles, but Revenant was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival. It was as if he had no concept of peace, no need for rest or reprieve. He had been forged for this one purpose, and now that it was done, she wasn't sure what came next. "What happens now?" Mara asked, her voice soft, but filled with a sense of dread she couldn't quite explain. "We've stopped the Kharn forces for now. The fleet is in disarray, but you will evacuate." Revenant cut her off, his gaze unyielding. "There are still survivors who need to be evacuated. The colony can't sustain itself without the reactor, but you don't need to worry about the rest. I'll handle them." His words were chilling in their certainty. He had never once questioned his purpose. He had been given a mission, and he had completed it with deadly precision. But there was no sign of triumph in his voice, no relief in his eyes, only cold detachment. Turan came up beside Mara, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly. "The evacuation is our priority. You've seen what Revenant can do. If we don't get to the escape pod soon, all of this will be for nothing." Mara nodded, though the unease still lingered. They had accomplished what seemed impossible. The Kharn forces were retreating, and their ships were scrambling to regroup. But she couldn't stop thinking about Revenant. He wasn't like other soldiers. They had seen war. They had seen the horrors it brought. But Revenant was something different, and that difference was starting to feel like a ticking time bomb. They moved quickly through the facility, making their way back toward the escape pods. The further they got from the reactor, the quieter the halls became. The adrenaline that had been surging through them during the battle was beginning to wear off, and fatigue set in. But there was no time for rest. They had to get to the pods before the Kharn forces regrouped. As they neared the pod bay, the sound of distant explosions echoed in the background. Turan's pace quickened. "The Kharn aren't gone," he muttered under his breath. "They're just regrouping. They'll be back." Mara didn't respond. Her mind was still on Revenant. She had seen him fight, seen the deadly precision in every movement. He was like a force of nature, a creature made for war. But she wasn't sure what would happen once the battle was over. What was left for him when there were no more enemies to fight? And worse still, what if there were no more enemies left to fight? The pod bay doors came into view, and the remaining survivors were already lined up, waiting for the final evacuation. Tyran moved to join them, but Mara stopped, her gaze fixed on the dim figure of Revenant who had followed them silently. "Are you coming?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Revenant didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the battlefield, where smoke still billowed from the wreckage of Xarn ships. His eyes flickered, cold and calculating. "I don't need to evacuate," he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My purpose is to eliminate all threats. The Xarn are not the last of them. There are others." Mara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The Xarn are the biggest threat to the colony. There's nothing left to fight." "There are always threats," Revenant replied simply, his gaze distant as if he were seeing something beyond the present moment. "I was made to deal with them." The Xarn were just the beginning. A shiver ran down Mara's spine. "What are you saying?" Revenant turned toward her, his gaze locking with hers. There was a chilling certainty in his eyes, like he knew something she didn't, something that made him even more dangerous than the Xarn. "I am not done," he said, his voice low. "The mission is not complete." Tyran stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "We're getting on those pods. Now." But even as Tyran spoke, a sudden explosion echoed from the hallway behind them, followed by the sound of footsteps pounding toward them. The Xarn were not retreating. They had regrouped faster than anyone had anticipated. Mara's pulse quickened. They had no choice now but to escape. But as they made their way toward the pods, Mara couldn't stop looking back at Revenant. His words had haunted her. The mission is not complete. What did that mean? Had they just unleashed something that was far more dangerous than the Xarn? In the distance, the shadows of Xarn soldiers appeared, their forms slowly becoming visible as they moved toward the bay. Revenant turned away from them, his figure already a blur as he sprinted back toward the battlefield. "You can't stay," Mara shouted after him. But Revenant didn't stop. His purpose had been made clear. He wasn't finished yet. He wasn't leaving until every threat, real or imagined, had been eliminated. The pods were launching. But Mara knew, with a sickening certainty, that their fight was far from over. And the real battle, one against something far darker than the Xarn, was only just beginning. The escape pods were launching one by one, their engines flaring to life, propelling them into the cold void of space. But Mara couldn't shake the feeling of dread that weighed heavily on her chest. She had just seen something in Revenant, something terrifying. The way he had spoken, as if there was a greater enemy looming on the horizon, something worse than the Xarn. The mission was not complete. She couldn't ignore his words, nor the chill that had settled deep in her bones. What had he meant? And why was he so sure that the threat wasn't over? The Xarn forces might have been in disarray, but if there was something worse than them, something beyond their understanding, humanity might not survive it. As the last of the survivors loaded into the pods and launched into space, Mara stood by the open bay door, watching the chaos of their escape. The colony, once a bustling hub of life, was now a smoldering ruin. The reactor had done its job, but it had come with a price. The shockwave had damaged critical systems, and the colony's remaining structure was on the brink of collapse. Every moment felt like a countdown to something more devastating. Tyran had already boarded his pod, giving her one last look before sealing the hatch. He knew what she was thinking. They both knew there was no safety out here, not with the Xarn still reeling and whatever else Revenant feared lurking in the depths of space. "Are you coming, Mara?" Tyran's voice crackled through her comlink, a hint of urgency in his tone. Mara hesitated for a moment longer, then gave a short nod to herself. There was no time to waste. They couldn't just sit here waiting for the unknown to come for them. She turned and started moving toward the pod bay. But just as her fingers brushed the cold metal of the hatch, A booming voice broke through the radio. Mara. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was Revenant. His voice was calm, distant, but there was something about it, something off. His tone was filled with an unsettling certainty, as if he had already seen the end of this story. "Revenant, where are you?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I'm still here," he responded cryptically. "You need to leave. You have no idea what's coming, what I've awakened." The hairs on the back of Mara's neck stood up. His words were laced with foreboding, but there was no fear in them. Only a grim acceptance, as if he knew something she didn't. Something important. "What are you talking about? You're not leaving with us?" Mara asked, the dread in her stomach now an overwhelming weight. Revenant didn't answer right away. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the escape pods as they drifted away from the colony. Then finally, his voice came again, softer this time, almost a whisper. The true enemy wasn't the Ktarn. They were just a test, a distraction. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, eyes scanning the empty corridor for some sign of him, but there was nothing. The last time she'd seen him, he had been charging toward the remaining Ktarn forces, his purpose clear, but now it seemed like there was more to the story. The real threat had never been the Ktarn. They were just the beginning. Her mind raced. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice tight. "I was made to fight, to eliminate." Revenant's voice was almost mechanical, but there was a hint of something else there, a burden he carried. "But what I was made for, what I was meant to destroy, it's much older than the Ktarn. It's something that has been waiting." She felt the ground beneath her tremble, a deep, vibrating pulse that reverberated through the metal floors. Her comm crackled with static as the power surged and flickered. A warning light blinked on the pod's control panel, signaling a sudden malfunction. She quickly checked the nearby display, and her heart sank. "Revenant, what's happening?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. The pod's systems were failing. "Something is awakening," Revenant replied, his voice low, almost sorrowful. "And you need to get away before it finds you." Before she could respond, the comlink cut off. The radio went dead, and the pod systems went dark. The only thing that remained was the faint, distant hum of the reactor and the deep, ominous pulse that seemed to resonate from somewhere beyond the colony. Mara quickly checked the remaining systems, but there was no time to fix anything. The pod's exterior was already being pulled by some unseen force, something powerful, ancient. The pod's thrusters sputtered, struggling to keep them on course. She activated the manual override, but it was useless. The pod was caught in a gravitational pull that was dragging them away from the safe zone. "No!" Mara screamed, slamming her fist against the control panel in frustration. She felt a sharp chill in the air, colder than it had been before. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and as she looked out the observation window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A massive ship, unlike anything the Ktarn had ever built, was slowly emerging from the wreckage of the colony. Its surface was dark, covered in strange symbols, pulsing with an unnatural energy that made the very fabric of space seem to tremble. It was huge, massive beyond comprehension. And as it moved, it was drawing everything in its path toward it. The pod, the colony, even the debris. It was all being pulled toward this thing. Mara's mind raced, her breath shallow. This was what Revenant had been warning her about. This wasn't just another alien force. They were dealing with something much older, far more powerful than the Ktarn could ever have been. "Revenant, what is that?" Mara demanded, even though she knew the answer. But there was no reply. The comm was still dead. She tried to focus, her mind working in overdrive. She had to find a way out of this. The pod was still malfunctioning, and the alien ship was getting closer. Every moment they lingered here was another moment that they could be sucked into the maw of this ancient, terrifying vessel. Mara looked to the nearby consoles, trying to pull up a map of the ship's systems. There had to be something she could use to override the pull, something to break free from this gravitational force. And then, as if in answer to her thoughts, a sudden realization hit her. The Karn fleet. It had been damaged by the reactor's pulse, but if she could use their remaining ships, their weapons, she might be able to create a temporary escape route. If she could get one of them operational, they could break free before the alien ship could finish its descent into the colony's destruction. Her mind made up, she gritted her teeth and made her way toward the nearest ship. There was no time to lose. She had to get to the fleet before the ancient enemy could complete its arrival. But even as she moved toward the exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that what they were facing was beyond their ability to fight back. What if Revenant was right? What if this was just the beginning of something far worse? The pod continued its erratic course, its systems flickering and struggling against the unseen force that was pulling everything toward the dark, looming ship. Mara's heart raced, her mind desperately trying to process everything. The terror that had begun with the Karn was nothing compared to what was emerging now, something older and more powerful than she could comprehend. She had to act fast. The escape route she had envisioned was becoming increasingly impossible to reach. The gravitational force of the alien vessel was intensifying, and her pod was rapidly being dragged toward its dark maw. The entire colony, now a shattered remnant of its former self, seemed to be slowly folding into this looming nightmare. The walls of the pod groaned, straining under the pressure of the pull. Outside, the Karn ships, their damaged forms flickering and sparking, were also caught in the gravitational pull, being drawn toward the enormous vessel with no way to escape. There was no chance of reinforcements coming, no more military strategies, no more alliances that could save them. Only a few broken escape pods, the few remaining survivors, and this eerie, overwhelming presence in the void. Mara gripped the controls with trembling hands, trying to steady herself. She had to break free, had to make it to the fleet or they were all lost. But the alien ship, this thing, this ancient force, was dominating everything around her. It wasn't just a ship, it was a weapon, a living nightmare from the depths of space. And it wasn't just pulling her in, it was erasing all hope. Her thoughts returned to Revenant. What had he meant when he said that the Karn were only a distraction? What was this force that had woken up? She couldn't let that thought settle in her mind. Not yet. There was no room for doubt now. Revenant had warned her. There was no mistaking the certainty in his voice. The true enemy wasn't the Karn, but what was it, exactly, that was coming for them? What had he been made to fight? The pods were still being dragged toward the alien vessel, but a low, unnatural hum filled the pod's interior, vibrating through the metal and causing her bones to ache with the force of it. It was like the entire universe was being tuned to some dark, unseen frequency. The pull grew stronger, the edges of space itself warping as if bending under the weight of this ancient power. Then suddenly, a blinding flash of light appeared outside the pod, a burst of energy so intense that Mara could feel it even through the hull. For a moment, everything went white. Her body seemed to freeze in time, suspended in the grip of an unimaginable force. The air around her hummed and buzzed as though something beyond her comprehension was happening. The blinding light dissipated, and for a split second, the gravitational pull eased, just enough to give her a moment to think. The system alerts began to blare, warning her of the imminent destruction of her pod. She had seconds, maybe less, before it would be torn apart by the gravitational anomaly. She didn't have time to contemplate what was coming. She only had time to act. Mara's eyes scanned the controls, her fingers moving quickly as she activated the manual override. She had one shot at this. She opened a communication channel to the remaining fleet, hoping to reach anyone who could still offer assistance. The pod systems were barely functional, but the comm still hummed with the faintest connection. Anyone on comms? She gasped, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, could hear her. The static buzzed louder, distorting her voice. But then, through the static, a faint voice crackled through the noise. "Mara, is that you?" Tehran's voice was shaky, distorted, but she could hear the tension in his words. "We're being pulled in too. We can't escape this. What's going on?" "I don't know," she shouted, desperation flooding her words. "There's something far worse than the Tarn. We need to find a way to escape this gravitational pull, or we're all finished." Before Tehran could respond, the ship's proximity alarms blared. The alien vessel was closing in rapidly. There was no time left. Then, just as suddenly as the pull had increased, the strange energy wave that had pulsed earlier returned, this time more intense, more deliberate. The space around them seemed to bend and ripple like a wave on the ocean, twisting the very fabric of reality. Mara's pod jerked violently, the hull groaning as though it were about to be torn apart. She gripped the controls with all her strength, her breath shallow, trying to steady herself in the midst of the chaos. A crackling, distorted voice suddenly echoed through her comms once more. This time, it wasn't Tehran's voice. "Mara, we can't escape. You must stop." The voice was fragmented, broken. The words were impossible to understand, but the urgency behind them was unmistakable. And then she saw it. Through the small viewports, the alien ship, this ancient vessel, loomed closer, its surface pulsating with energy. But it wasn't just a ship anymore. As it approached, its shape seemed to shimmer and distort, like something organic, alive in ways Mara couldn't describe. Dark tendrils of energy reached out, stretching toward her pod, toward the remaining fleet, toward all of them. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. The reality of what was happening, what Revenant had warned her about, was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a ship. It was a force, a living entity from the darkest corners of space. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for them to stumble into its grasp. The voice on the comms returned, more coherent now, but laced with an indescribable horror. "You must stop it, Mara. It is the end." And in that moment, Mara realized what had to be done. The only way to survive, the only way to stop this thing, was to destroy it from the inside. She had no idea how, but if she didn't, the ship would consume everything. The colony, the fleet, the entire system. Revenant had made it clear that the battle wasn't over. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. It was only just beginning.